level 1. Are we ready to face this new normal? We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to the Chiefs. I'm Robbie Alampay, also with us online. Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star and Ed Lingao will join us later. Ami, good evening.
Not so happy Friday, ha? Ang gulo ng mundo, no?
Pero let's start also with the big thing, the big context for us. It's happy 36th anniversary for People Power, for the return of democracy to the Philippines. That's a big thing.
Yes.
But I know what you're talking about, di ba? Talagang ang Russia mukhang binomba na, sinugod na talaga ang Ukraine.
Oo nga eh. Well, dati naman inanex nila yung Crimea, di ba, noong 2014 eh.
Yes.
Hindi naman nagkagulo ng husto. Kaya lang ngayon nga, may problema tayo, may pandemya tayo ngayon eh. Yan ang problema natin. Kaya yung impact sa economy natin, yun ang ano.
Oo.
Yun ang problema ng lahat.
Oh, and, we started late. We might as well get straight into that topic. We have with us tonight Octa Research Fellow, Dr. Guido David. Professor David, welcome once again to the Chiefs.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, Robbie and Ami. Yes, tama nga kayo, nagkakagulo sa mundo. So, COVID is going to take a backseat suddenly to bigger issues.
Yeah, but hopefully at least on that front, on the COVID front, maybe you could give us some insights for at least, diba, something for us to cheer about. Do we? I mean, look, the numbers seem to be holding. The downward trend seems to be holding. I guess my first question is, does the downward trend already factor in all the political activities and campaigns that started 2-3 weeks ago?
Yes, Robbie. So, isa-isay natin. The downward trend is holding. Positivity rate is na at 4% in NCR. And yung healthcare utilization, it's at 25% in NCR. If we compare it, yung best month natin, December 10 to 16, actually compared it to sa Go Negosyo webinar, yung healthcare utilization rate at that time was 24%. So, we're already comparable sa healthcare utilization during our best week last year, no, December 10 to 16. Yung positivity rate, not quite there yet, but it's going to get there. And yung ADAR, hindi pa ganun kababa rin. It's at around 2, but we're getting there. So it looks like numbers are continuing to improve. We're not seeing a significant threat. We have seen mga more than 2 weeks of political activities. Wala pa tayong nakikitang noticeable or notable uptick. Upticks are okay as long as we don't see a major surge tulad ng January. So we're not seeing any major surge. We don't think a major surge will happen.
But at the same time, the nature of those campaigns, knock on wood, diba? Sana, like we said, sana considered na yan dito sa mga nakikita nating trends. But two things lang to note about those campaigns. One is more and more that's going out of Metro Manila. More and more we're seeing these big rallies. And to that point, those rallies are in fact becoming bigger. So are we still bracing for any effects from that?
There could be effects, Robbie, kasi yes, we might not have seen effects dito sa NCR because we're heavily vaccinated in the NCR and we have significant population immunity from infections with Omicron. But there are provinces na mababa yung vaccine coverage, and there's a genuine concern for provinces with low vaccine coverage kasi we have seen in other countries, pag nagkakaroon ng resurgence, it's usually the unvaccinated who are getting infected with COVID, with Omicron. So there's a concern with that. Hopefully, mababa na talaga yung cases. Pero syempre, kahit mababa yung cases sa isang province, pwede siyang ma-import din kung magkaroon ng campaign rallies. Someone could be bringing the virus to these places na mababa yung vaccination.
Saka yung isa pang tanong, we've been asking it a lot lately dahil nga dun sa pagkalat ng mga antigen testing and given the nature of Omicron, accurate pa bang data nyo up to now? Kasi alam ko, napakarami ng tao na hindi na nag-RT-PCR unless they're traveling, pupunta sa kung saan, magbabakasyon. Saka lang nila nalalaman positive pala sila sa RT-PCR. So accurate po ba yung mga data?
Well, that's a valid point, Ami. We estimated noon based on the recent bar exams. Actually, yung bar exam was a good indicator kasi there was a 1% positivity rate at that time. And based on that, nung pinaject natin sa population, it looks like the number of cases nationally na counting the unreported cases, yung mga nagpapa-antigen, it could be about 10 times higher than what is officially reported by the Department of Health. This should not be surprising kasi may mga comparable studies that says na this is actually the a working range for the number of cases. So kunyari, if we have 1,700 today, 1,600, the actual number could be 10 times higher. It could be 16,000 cases pa. But the trend is valid. So ibig sabihin, kahit 10 times higher, dati, mas mataas. When we had 30,000, it was probably closer to 300,000 cases. So the trends are valid. We're seeing a decrease in positivity rate. Pero may mga provinces with with a high positivity rate and low testing, we are still concerned about those. So hopefully they will be kept at maybe alert level 2 or 3. NCR, at least, we have a low positivity rate. And the fact na yung healthcare utilization is decreasing, it supports the finding na the trend is decreasing. Kasi otherwise, kung marami pang cases, we should be seeing it in the hospitals.
Pero that's still pretty high, di ba? Kung sabihin mo times 10, 1,000 cases a day, 10,000 cases, medyo malaki pa rin yun. And mataas pa rin yung hindi vaccinated natin at hindi boosted. I'm asking this kasi nagsasabi yung mga hospital associations at some groups of doctors, sabi nila kung maaari daw medyo extend pa yung alert level 2 in the NCR kahit mga 1 or 2 weeks. Is that a valid suggestion?
Right. It's valid naman, Ami. And alam niyo naman kami, I mean, yung OCTA, we have been traditionally very cautious. Pero at the same time, we have other concerns as well ngayon. And at some point, I think we have to take some risks. And if it's a calculated risk naman na we don't think as long as the cases are decreasing, we don't think it will prolong the surge or it will cause a reversal in the trend. We think it's okay. And there are, as we mentioned kanina, there are now probably more serious issues around the world. And at least on the bright side, sa atin, cases are decreasing, even as yung mga neighbors natin. In fact, we have the best numbers right now in Southeast Asia. Singapore's increasing. They have 20,000 cases. Malaysia's increasing. Indonesia's increasing. Thailand, Vietnam, they're increasing. South Korea is at 100,000 cases.
But Professor, given that, as you said, we may in fact be blind. I mean, for a long time now, but we may be blind to the entire number. That question always comes from the point of view that for the longest time, new cases daily was not only the most accessible for a lot of people, it was also the most important number to track. But now you've referenced utilization rate, positivity rate, and so on. At this point, what's the most important metric? I mean, maybe we're all still too focused on new cases per day. But what's the most important metric that maybe the public can also focus on these days?
And that's a very valid point. I mean, some people, especially yung mga people from the business community, are saying that the most important metric is the healthcare utilization. So if we are living with the virus and treating this like the flu, that would be valid as long as hospitals are not getting filled up. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, even during the peak of the surge ng Omicron, the hospital system was not really threatened. So that could be the most important metric. But at the same time, of course, we recognize that not everyone got Omicron, and there are some people na, there's me, for example, I didn't get the Omicron. So I still want to be cautious na, kumaga, umabot na ako dito. So might as well try not to get it. So you just need to practice caution for people like me who would rather not get the virus. But for most people, it's only mild or asymptomatic and not leading to hospital. So that's a very important number there. And that's why siguro we can take more risks because of the high level of vaccination. Yes, concern natin provinces with a low vaccination rate because from the data that we have, even in other countries, pag hindi vaccinated, they could be affected at the same rate. They will get the same risk of hospitalization as 2 years ago with the original virus. So ibig sabihin, mataas pa rin ang risk of hospitalization for unvaccinated. But if we are vaccinated, and in NCR we're heavily vaccinated, that's why I think we can take some risk in NCR. But we should still be cautious in areas na low vaccine coverage, medyo mataas pa yung healthcare utilization, or medyo mataas pa yung positivity rate, because the positivity rate is a very honest indicator.
Well, speaking of metrics, sabi nga ng Malacanang, dadagdagan daw nilang requirement for de-escalating to alert level 1, yung vaccination ng seniors and people with comorbidities. Dapat daw umabot ng mga 80%. Is that also a sound suggestion?
I think that's sound naman, Ami, and that's a fair ask of I think DILG or DOH yung nag-ask niyan. And so I think if we're looking at NCR, siguro papasa na tayo sa 80%. So we can think of it as a parang scorecard. So pag may province na mababa yung vaccination rate ng seniors, and I think there's some concern because in Hong Kong we're seeing a huge surge, and it's not just a surge of not like what happened in NCR. Na we had a surge, but karamihan mild or asymptomatic. Sa kanila, they're getting a high number of hospitalizations because yung seniors nila mataas nga daw yung hospitalization rate, because apparently, and I didn't know this, na sa Hong Kong maraming seniors are unvaccinated, and that's why siguro this became one of the metrics ng national government. Okay, kailangan 80% vaccination in one area ang seniors para pumasa sa alert level 1.
Now, coming back here, nabanggit nyo nga, no, especially because, and we want to emphasize that, especially because most people are vaccinated, mababa mostly it's mild to asymptomatic, but we want to ask also about, what about mortality rate? What does that look like? And I mean, particularly between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
And that's the question we have been wanting to answer for the longest time, Robbie, yung ano ba dito yung mga sa mortality, yung mga unvaccinated and vaccinated. Unfortunately, we still don't have data for that. And some people are concerned kasi they're seeing still high numbers of deaths every day.
Yeah, but sorry, can we just ask, why don't we have that data? I mean, why is it that hard to get that data and to cross-reference those who are dying versus whether or not they're vaccinated or unvaccinated? Why is it that hard?
Well, we don't have that data from the DOH. In fact, we don't have even the basic data. They're still backlogged by 1 week, yung just getting the basic data. So I mean, that's something we will have to ask the Department of Health. I mean, I can try to get that data from some hospitals here. Pero I was looking at some data from LGUs here in Metro Manila, and because we're heavily vaccinated, we're not going to be seeing that a high number of deaths for unvaccinated. I would have to see that from data from provinces. That's a problem. We don't have access to data from provinces, and if the DOH does not give us that data, or they don't have that data, then we don't have that data as well.
Well, outside the NCR, what are the other areas of concern? Kasi today, the city of Baguio and Negros Occidental, sabi nila, ayaw pa daw nilang mag-de-escalate because they still have a lot. They're still worried na hindi pa ganun ka-certain yung pagbaba ng mga COVID cases nila. They're not sure if this will be sustained, and considering all the election activities going on, they're worried about it. Ano ba yung mga areas of concern pa outside the Metro Manila?
And that's surprising, Ami. I mean, from our metrics, Bacolod has comparable metrics with NCR. I just don't know about their vaccination metrics. Pero in terms of yung ADAR nila, yung positivity rate, it looks good. We are already considering them low risk. Baguio City, higher ADAR, but they're also looking good from our perspective. Low risk, but I guess if they want to be more conservative, more cautious, we definitely respect that. Syempre, they might be seeing other things on the ground that we're not seeing based on the numbers. So, and they might have reason to be cautious. Pero generally, yung mga areas of concern natin, yung mga areas with high positivity rate, mostly nasa Mindanao area. For example, General Santos has a very high positivity rate. Puerto Princesa has a high positivity rate. So, but in terms of trends, they're all decreasing naman. They're all on a downtrend. Ang concern lang natin is because of the high positivity rate. And I mentioned kanina, it's an honest indicator. There could be concern na kulang yung testing nila, and that's why they have a high positivity rate. And maybe that's why the number of cases is low. In the NCR, we don't have that big of a concern kasi the positivity rate is low. So we don't think na kulang naman yung testing dito sa NCR.
Hey, Professor, sorry, balikan ko lang yung data that you do not have and or you do not have access to, because those are two different things. I won't ask you to, and let's be clear, I'm not asking you to speak for the DOH, but which is it? I mean, you don't have access to the data, or even the DOH does not have that data? I mean, just to remind, we're talking about whether or not the people who are dying, and what's the percentage of people who are dying were vaccinated or not vaccinated. You're saying you don't have that, you don't have access to that data, or you don't have that data. But the question is, do we presume that the data at the very least is there, and at the very least is in the hands of the DOH?
Okay, firstly, regarding the data ng DOH, they normally have this, I mean, yes, they have the bulletin, they announce it in their Twitter and their social media, and they post it on their website. So this is updated daily. Pero yung detailed data that we used to access, we download these Excel or PDF files. They are delayed by 1 week. So, and they're only updated every weekend. And DOH made that clear. So, so tomorrow, February 26th, I will have access to their data for February 19, so 1 week. So it's not really that useful anymore because I'll be looking at past data. It's not good for trend analysis. Pero, okay, granted, 1 week late siya, but if it has the data na for the vaccinated and unvaccinated, that will still be helpful kasi anyway, the Omicron surge is already almost over. So if, you know, it's okay if it's a backlog as long as we can see sino nga ba yung nasa mortality list. I mean, are these vaccinated or unvaccinated? Unfortunately, even that data, and ever since, they never tabulated or accounted for cases who are vaccinated and who are not vaccinated. So I'm not sure if they have that data, but I know that some local governments in NCR have this data, and I have seen that. Pero because of the high vaccination rates NCR, the number of mortality, the number of deaths in the NCR due to unvaccinated is also low because there are hardly unvaccinated people now in the NCR. But also in the NCR, the number of deaths anyway has dropped to very low levels. Ngayon, for provinces, especially those with low vaccine coverage, we don't have access to that data. I'm not sure if DOH has that data, but they don't publish that either.
Okay, Professor Guido David of Octa Research. Sir, maraming salamat po. We always appreciate the updates.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, and good evening, Robbie and Amy, and let's hope for the best sa Ukraine
For once,
conflict.
positive kayo lagi.
Positive,
Okay.
but not with the Ukraine-Russia. Sorry. We're hoping for the best.
Okay,
Bye, good
maraming
evening.
salamat po. Please stay right there. We'll take a break. The Chiefs will be right back. Welcome back to the Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay with Ami Pamintuan. And before we continue, we just want to say we know a lot of people were expecting Greco Bellica to join us. He's running for senator. Usually Wednesdays and Fridays we set aside to talk to candidates. For whatever reason, we couldn't get in contact with Mr. Bellica, and we'll try to get him on another show. But the good news is, wala si Greco Bellica, pero nandito si Ed Lingao. And not only that, pero kung lugi kayo kay Ed Lingao, meron pa rin tayong ibang guest. And I'll let Ed introduce our next guest and our next topic.
Yeah. Well, Professor, somehow that doesn't sound right, but sige, let's go with that. Sige. Now we want to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and joining us in our discussion is military analyst and historian Jose Antonio Custodio. Hi, sir. Magandang gabi, and welcome back to the Chiefs.
Hello, yes.
Magandang gabi
Hello,
po.
everybody. Hello, Amy. Hello, Ed. And
Yes,
hello,
sir.
Robbie, who is... Sir, what are you calling me, sir? I'm getting old.
Oh, sir, I can see very clearly behind you. You have a lot of Russian tank and
Yes,
armored
yeah.
personnel
Yes,
models.
yes,
T-55, Su-122.
There, yeah.
So
Keeps
you're-
us sane.
It's keeping
Keeps
with
me sane.
the times. Sir, of course, we want to ask you about Ukraine and
Yeah.
Russia. Specifically, kasi I suppose a lot of people are confounded by the thought na sino ba talagang tama, sino mali? Because on one hand, you have Russia wanting to protect its borders and its security.
Yeah.
On the other hand naman, you have Ukraine, which you suppose would have or should have its own right to self-determination, to join
Yes.
whatever side it wants to join. So how should Filipinos look at this?
But basically, you were asking which one is right or which one is wrong. But basically, it's like this: every state has the right to protect its borders, right?
Yes.
But not at the expense of somebody else's borders. Okay, that's another thing altogether, diba? And in the case of Russia, it's not a matter of just respect of protecting its borders. It wants to project its suzerainty to another state in order to make it a pliant state, no? And that is the problem here, you know, the fact that Russia is and that Ukraine submit to its writ, no? Which is something that Ukraine does not want to do. And there's a long history of Ukraine-Russian problems, you know, that stretches way back to the Stalinist era and even earlier. We shouldn't
Ukrainian
forget
famine, for example.
the massive famines of the 1930s of the Stalinist era, when forced collectivization resulted in the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. You know, and that is embedded in the Ukrainian national consciousness. So what Moscow did to it, and that fueled desires of Ukraine to become independent. And in fact, during the German invasion of the USSR in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, initially the Ukrainians welcomed the Germans as liberators. They thought they were liberators, only to find out that the Germans were just as mean and as brutal as Moscow, you know. So, and then that's basically it's not just 2014, because many people, especially those with some agenda, they try to stop. It goes way earlier than that, you know. So if you are going to understand the problems between the two existing states now.
Siguro yung background na yan, Mr. Custodio, is the reason kasi today, the President of Ukraine was lamenting na nag-iisa lang daw sila. We are fighting Russia alone. Wala daw tumutulong sa kanila in the armed conflict. How can you explain that?
Well, basically, that is a soundbite of the president. Okay, that's a soundbite. Basically, it's to project to the international community that we need aid. Okay. But because the reality on the ground is actually there are a lot of countries assisting Ukraine. They're making fun of NATO and the U.S., especially in Republican circles in the U.S. You know, they're saying that the NATO is weak and not. But actually, short of deploying armed combat units in Ukraine, the support that NATO and is giving to the Ukrainian military is significant. Especially the fact that those weapons that are being used to kill Russian tanks that we've been seeing pictures of in the past hours. You know, earlier this day we've seen a lot of Russian armored vehicles knocked out. quite a number of those weapons have been coming from NATO and US stocks. So it's not really true. They are going it alone. Yes, in terms of fighters, they are going through it alone. Okay, but in terms of material support and even moral support, like for example, because they're facing cyber attacks now from Russia, they're calling in South Korea. Imagine a country as far away as South Korea supporting, going to, if they agree to it, they'll be supporting Ukraine in countering the cyber attack. Well, and then of course you have Singapore condemning the what the Russians did. So many other countries are on the side of on Ukraine when it comes to condemning the invasion and in actually giving physical support. Private groups have been actually raising funds for the Ukrainian military. Sorry, yes, I've been.
Professor, slow down tayo. Slow down tayo.
Call me Jose. Call me Jose.
No, pero ano tayo, slow down tayo ng konti. Because really, I mean, in all honesty, even myself, I will count myself as this is still 101 for me. No?
Okay.
So let's talk motives. You mentioned kanina, Russia wants to make Ukraine a client state. Very basic question. What's a client state? Can you explain the dynamics there?
Well, basically, it's a state that if we, para sa sa lingwahe ng mga ng street, ay sasabihin natin, tuta ng Russia. Yan, ganun kasimple lang yan.
Okay.
It's a puppet state, no? Tuta siya ng Russia. And that's what Russia wants, It wants to turn Ukraine into another, which is basically a pliant tuta state, no? If it can get that, if it can't get that, then just neutralize it, like what they did to Finland in 1939, 1940, when they launched the Winter War against Finland, parang binugbog nila para maging neutral ang Finland. No? They forced it into neutrality. No? That's what they did. So they're hoping that either they turn Ukraine into isang tuta nila or a puppet of theirs, or if not, something like a forced neutrality. No?
Okay. Now, explain a bit also, I mean, on the history of this, I mean, and at least from the standpoint of how Putin is framing it, diba? Putin is saying, look, remember, in the Soviet era, magkasama kami, and even before that, the Ukrainians and the Russians were not only neighbors, we are in fact ethnically, culturally intertwined. On the west side, you have people who actually, in fact, the ethnic groups there do in fact speak more Russian. On the west side, people do speak Ukrainian, which may sound similar to our ears, but it is actually very different. They can make a distinction. And in that connection, Putin is saying, there are real ties that bind here. And in fact, he's saying there are real reasons for us to also protect some regions here. That, speaking of naghiwa-hiwalay na states, there are provinces supposedly in Ukraine that also want to say that, no, we also want to be independent. If Ukraine can understand aspiring for independence, what about us? We also want to be independent, and so on. And then it becomes even more convoluted. Can you take us through, if not, what are objective facts there, at least what are the dynamics that we need to understand in all of those assertions?
Well, basically, you have, yung the length and the breadth of history na sinabi ko na, and the obvious result of that is the presence of ethnic Russians in large areas of eastern Ukraine, which is then the problem that Moscow grabbed on, in order to, pressure the Ukrainian government. And that became their preferred method, beginning 2014. So one was when they lost the control of the Ukrainian government, when the pro-Russian Ukrainian president was ousted and replaced by a president who was espousing Ukrainian national interests. That didn't sit well with the Russians, and they proceeded now to support these secessionist groups that were in the eastern side of Ukraine, which of course led to that tragic downing of that Malaysian airline. And then at the same time, you had the annexation of Crimea, which was also another ethnically problematic region for Ukraine. And those two showed displeasure at the very least, no, of Moscow to Ukraine. That resulted, however, in a series of negotiations. That's why you had the Minsk agreement, but that didn't really lead to peace because well, it's difficult, for a country to just allow another region to secede. We have our own secessionist problem here. Then it's doubly complicated when you have a foreign power now aiding and abetting that secessionist movement, which is what Russia was doing. That eventually festered on, and it leads us to this situation now, wherein Ukraine, on one side of Ukraine, thinking that it is under threat of Russia, it drifted further and further, more and more into NATO and US circles. In fact, from 2014 onwards, of the modernization and capability enhancement of the Ukrainian military, the US and NATO have been playing a very big role in it, especially in training. I said a while ago, training special operations and units and such, and provision of even equipment. But then at this time, that was in order to create a deterrent factor in the
Okay.
Ukrainian military.
Okay.
So there, yeah.
So
Professor,
itong
what are-
invasion na to, ano yung short-term end game na nakikita nyo with Putin? Is he trying to oust the president of Ukraine and replace him with his guys?
Well, the thing kasi with Putin is that well, it's easy to say that he will oust him and then just, the Ukrainian president and install a more pliant one, or a more or a puppet for all intents and purposes. But the thing is that can he? It really depends on the Ukrainians how much fight are they willing to put into the field and into the battlefield. Are they willing to fight as hard as the Chechens fought in the first Chechen war was a disaster for the Russian military in the early 1990s. So if the Ukrainians are willing to fight as hard as the Chechens did in 1990s, in the early 1990s, then because the Ukrainians have more equipment, have more support from the international community, then Russia might find itself in a problematic situation of a war that will drag on. Okay, especially if even if for the Kiev will not result in the fall of the country per se. If they retreat further into the because one thing that the Russians have to understand is that, or apparently understand, is that that there are only two sides of the Ukraine that are, or three sides of the Ukraine that are vulnerable. Of course, there's the sea, and then there's that border with Russia, and then there's that border with Belarus. But the other borders are sympathetic countries to Ukraine, like Poland and Romania being two countries that provide support and provide the necessary logistics for a Ukrainian state to exist still in Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russians would occupy a portion or or the eastern to northern side of the country. So that's something that Putin has to figure out. Of course, he wants to overrun the entire country, but can he do it? Especially with the forces that he has allotted, they are coming in piecemeal, and that they look at the the Russians. The Soviet kasi ugaling Soviet na sila. So if you look at the Russians kasi, their deployment was like 200,000 men initially, just before the invasion. So if you look at it and then you compare to the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian armed forces together with its reserve outnumber you. So are you going to launch an invasion? But nobody expected the Russians to launch an invasion in that manner, and because they did, then they started bleeding badly for it. That's why I was mentioning a while ago, Ukrainian units were wiping out columns of Russian armored vehicles. Because parang kulang sila kulang and mabagal, ang movement nila. And in fact, a raid, assaults on certain key installations were were repulsed with bloody losses to the Russians. No? So the Ukrainians are putting up a fight. You know? But how long can they sustain that fight? It's really up to the Ukrainians. No?
Pero, sir-
It's also up to the
Yes,
inspire if the Ukrainian president is inspired to lead.
Yes, sir. What are the chances of the U.S. getting drawn into a ground war, whether with special forces units or eventually a conventional military unit? Because I'd imagine that the U.S. does not want to go head to head with Russia. They always try to avoid any appearance of fighting the Russians, even though there were instances in the past in over the skies of North Vietnam, for example, where Americans fought Soviets.
Like or in the neutralization of North Vietnamese missile batteries,
Yes.
wherein Soviet technical advisors were there, or in the Middle East, where the Israelis shut down Soviet Air Force aircraft. Now the thing is that in the case of the U.S., combat units are ruled out definitely, unless we want World War III. The thing is that short of that, there's a lot of exchanges going on. I would not be surprised if the Ukrainians are having a motherlode of intel information from U.S. satellites, because that is what the U.S. did for Great Britain during the Falklands War. They were furnishing intel to the British government from U.S. satellites regarding Argentine movement. And I would bet the same thing is happening for the Ukrainian military. Advisors would be on ground. Definitely there would be on ground.
But
A number of them.
But if you listen to the latest statements from President Zelensky, you get the impression that Ukraine is saying, "Look, we need more help than that."
Yeah. Yes. Well, basically, that would it's something he does realize also. He does understand that he can't have NATO fighting in his soil. He does know that, and that's why it's really a challenging task for the Ukrainian military to buy time.
Sige.
Kasi ganito yan eh. Of course, countries that want to help will look at the Ukrainian military and see, are you going to fight? Or are you going to end up like the Afghan army? So if you fight, then collapse quickly. Well, you collapsed. So so that's the thing. So the next days are crucial for the Ukrainian military
Okay,
to
yeah, but
continue fighting. And yes.
But
Ang tanong ngayon ay, how worried should we be, especially if the conflict becomes protracted?
Alam mo naman kasi, diba, after a few weeks and so, the market stabilizes again because, hindi pala nag-World War III. Ganun yun no? So in that matter, a protracted war is actually not beneficial for Russia in the long run kasi they will become, if they want to turn Ukraine into their puppet state, a long drawn-out war there will turn them into a puppet state of China.
But short of World War III, short of any kind of a military confrontation, right now the main mode of engagement or pressure is economic sanctions. Those economic sanctions will hit Russia and Ukraine on two fronts. I mean, fuel will be included there, the energy sector, and not to mention wheat. Both countries are top producers and exporters and suppliers of wheat worldwide. That impacts not only fuel prices, but also food commodities, bread in particular. So those kinds of things, even without a military confrontation, how bad can it get for the rest of the world, including us?
It's basically those are questions that will be answered in detail by an economist. But for me, the concern basically is the economic side kasi. I'm a bit optimistic, in a sense, that if the conflict is contained in the Ukraine only, the economies of the countries in EU will find a way to adapt. Life goes on. Ganun yun as long as the conflict is contained there. There might be a problem with the border states like Poland and Germany and Romania because sila yung they will have some spillover, that will happen. Maybe an errant missile will slam into German territory or Polish territory, or more on Poland pa lang, Poland and Romania. Germany pa medyo pala, but more on Poland and Romania, no? So those areas would have more heightened security, would have more disruption. But countries in the western side, if they're able to solve their fuel issues, their energy issues, then things can stabilize eventually. Maybe a year or less than that. So I'm not exactly that worried. But of course, for countries like the Philippines, well, any price increase is bad for us, because we are not exactly a developed, strong country. So if fuel goes up, kawawa yung mga tao dito. No? I mean, prices go up and inflation happens. And we're already in the midst of a pandemic, which has brought its economic problems. And then you add fuel price increases to already our battered countrymen, then that's something that's not going to be a welcome for us specifically. But again, but the thing is that again, I would always like to reiterate here that the sanctions, though yes, they are significant, but what will stop what will stop the Russians on the ground is not sanctions per se, but it's the amount of military aid that will pour through Ukraine from countries sympathetic to it. Yeah? As long as they don't run out of munitions, as long as they are able to put up a good fight wherein they are able to have maneuver territory for cut off, because the Russians will try to do that. They'll try to interdict and cut off the Ukrainians from their sources, But as long as it doesn't happen, then that other aspect of international assistance will continue, and that is quite decisive,
Okay.
which is the military assistance to Ukraine. And it's interesting to see what forms will it take in the next few days.
Okay.
Like, for example, will we see shipments of more to the Ukraine coming from Western governments?
Okay, Professor Custodio, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Mr.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank
Professor
you.
Jose Antonio Custodio, military analyst and historian. That will be all for this edition of the Chiefs. We hope it was discussed here. We'll keep the conversation going. Before we go, a reminder to our viewers, mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. I'm Robbie Alampay.
I'm Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star.
I'm Ed Lingao, and we are One News.